This is a quote from your book on page 97, and you're referring to what some of the literature historians of the time actually did. You said, did they invent speeches? Yes. Do they paraphrase and elaborate in order to improve the quality of a speech or even a narrative? Yes. Do they change a statement to a question and express a thought in any number of different ways? Yes. Do we see them doing this in their own writing? Yes. Do we see them doing this with the writings of others? Yes. Do you observe Matthew and Luke often paraphrasing Mark in these ways? Yes. Now, some of these wouldn't give people pause, but when you say, did they invent speeches? That's going to give a lot of people pause and go, whoa, time out, Mike. Now there's willingly these literary devices that we assume the gospel writers are using. We don't know when they use it. It involves invention and creation. We've opened up, the camel's nose is under the tent, so to speak. How do we make any distinctions now between what was invented and what's not invented?
Well, I like that word picture. That's funny. So Thucydides is one of the first, perhaps the first, to talk about speeches. Okay, and he's considered to be the greatest ancient historian. And people, according to Lucian, would pattern how they wrote after Thucydides. So Thucydides talks about, you want to try to reproduce a speech as accurately as possible. Okay. Now, of course, when Thucydides is writing, there's no audio recorders. There was no shorthand even at that time. So you're trying to recall these things from memory as best as possible. And he said, so in essence, you're trying, there's no way you can get word for word unless the speech had been written down and you have the document. You're trying to recall it as best as possible. And in cases where you don't know what was said on that occasion, you want to create that speech, craft the speech that you knew was given on that occasion, or surmise that it was given on that occasion. You want to craft a speech that would be the verisimilitude would be there. It would be something like what we would expect to have heard. So just an example, in the War with Catiline, written by Sallust, who knew Julius Caesar. He was one of the great Roman historians, and he will reproduce speeches like when Catiline was facing up his army and getting them ready to face Rome's army that was coming out to crush his rebellion. He gives a speech that's reported by Sallust. Well, the reports are that there were no survivors, that the Roman army that came out from Rome crushed that rebellion, no survivors. So there was no one to say what that speech would have been like. So he crafted it to give it verisimilitude. This is probably what that speech would have been like, or Catiline would have probably given a speech to pump up his soldiers. And this is kind of the things that he would have said. There is an example of Julius Caesar. I think he was going to cross over to go to Britain, Britannia. I think it was Britannia back then, and they were going to fight him, and so it's like, okay, this is what the general for the Britain army would have said, but they have no idea what he would have said. So you craft a speech with verisimilitude. Lucian, probably around the middle of the 2nd century, he wrote the only extant treatment of describing how to write history. The title is How to Write History. And in that book, he's talking about crafting speeches. You want to be accurate, but you can take what was probably said, and the orator at that point, the historian, can use his oratory skills to take that speech and to make it sound really, really good. So when it comes to, say, speeches within the Gospels or the book of Acts, you got, there was no one there who was taking they didn't have audio recorders back then. There was no video recorders. People didn't have their mobile phones. I'm recording Peter here. At that point in the first century, shorthand was in its infancy stages, and probably the best people who were doing shorthand were in Rome. So it's probably the case that we are getting what Luke has done, and there's much debate and discussion over this. But I'd say at minimum, what Luke is doing is taking the kerygma, the basic message of the apostles at that time, and he's creating a speech. It's like, okay, well, Peter preached at Pentecost. This is probably what he would have said. Or Peter told me that these are some of the things he said. And then Luke crafts a speech. But we don't have word for word, certainly, for what was said on that occasion. We can get a pretty good idea, I suppose, but we're not going to have word for word. I'll close with this. More recent times, you got that famous speech, Liberty or Death speech by Patrick Henry. That speech is being recalled, I think it's 41 years later, by two eyewitnesses who took no notes. We have no surviving notes from Patrick Henry. So you've got two eyewitnesses who are trying to recall that speech by Patrick Henry 40 years later, having taken no notes. That Liberty or Death speech has been crafted by that author. I forgot his name, but crafted by that author who put this together based on the reminiscences of those two eyewitnesses. He probably got that one line correct: "Give me liberty or give me death." But the rest of it is they're trying to communicate the essence, the feeling of what was said on that occasion. And Sean, that's within recent times.
I think where, well, very well, people say there's a big difference between taking the speeches of Acts and summarizing them down, which when I read Keener years ago, I was like, oh, I never really thought about that. But that makes sense given the nature of a speech. And Paul might have talked for a long time. I mean, someone fell asleep and fell out of a window when Paul preached. So he's summarizing versus inventing and creating things. That's, of course, where some of the debate and the discussion, I think, difference would come in. Let's shift to the Gospel of John.
Well, hang on a second. That summarizing there, that fits with what I'd say on that.
Okay, how so?
Yeah. Well, because they're going to, we look at the creeds that you find in the New Testament. Death, burial, resurrection, appearances, things like that. How they're looking at this thing, what Jesus did is the fulfillment of prophecy. These would have been things called the kerygma that was going on around at that time. Luke would have been familiar with the kerygma, and so he's crafting a speech based on what he knew, the basic or an outline of the message that would have been given on that occasion.
I guess this is somewhat of a separate question, but when we look at these ancient writers, they obviously aren't guided by the Holy Spirit. This obviously isn't God breathed. So it brings in that element as well, which would probably take us aside. And I know you have a whole section in your book of what does that mean? How does God do this? So we'll kind of bracket that right there for now, but just want to make people aware of that distinction.